At 7:12 on a Tuesday morning, I heard an engine outside my office window that did not belong on our street. It was not a delivery truck. It was the steady hydraulic whine of a compact excavator, followed by the sound of stone sliding against stone. I looked through the blinds and saw a yellow machine sitting half on the sidewalk and half in the front edge of my yard. Its bucket was already inside the terrace my father and I had built by hand 12 years earlier. For a second, I honestly thought the crew had the wrong house. Then the bucket came up with a clump of coneflowers, mulch, and dark soil in it. One of the irrigation lines I had buried along the terrace wall was hanging loose like a black cord. Claire was downstairs making coffee. I called her name, grabbed my phone, and went outside. Our dog, Mabel, started barking at the machine from behind the storm door. Claire followed me onto the porch, saw the broken stone, and stopped beside me without saying anything. The first thing I did was not yell. I moved Mabel inside, told Claire to stay clear of the driveway, and started recording. There were 3 workers, orange cones, a trailer full of ornamental grasses, and a glossy sign leaned against the HOA entrance monument across the corner. The sign said Cedar Ridge Community Makeover in large blue letters. I walked to the edge of the work area and raised my hand. Who authorized work in my yard? The operator shut the machine down. The woman in the safety vest walked over. Her name was Lena Ortiz, and she introduced herself as the project manager for Green Line Landscape. She looked at the address on her tablet, then at me. "The association gave us this parcel as part of the entrance scope," she said. We were told owner authorization was confirmed. It was not, I said. I'm the owner. No one asked me. Lena did something I respected immediately. She did not argue. She told the operator to hold position and told the crew to stop moving material until she could call the person who gave the instruction. That did not fix the broken terrace or put the plants back in the ground, but it kept the damage from becoming twice as bad while people stood around explaining themselves. By the time Dana Kessler arrived, I had 6 minutes of video, a close shot of the job number on the trailer, and photographs of the exposed irrigation line, the uprooted shrubs, and the first section of stone that had been pushed loose. Dana stepped out of her SUV holding a rolled-up rendering board as if she had come to present a school project. Dana had been president of Cedar Ridge for 2 years. She was not loud. That was part of why people tended to give her the benefit of the doubt. She spoke in the language of committees, property values, timelines, and neighborhood cohesion. If you challenged her, she had a way of making it sound as though you were resisting something everyone else had already agreed was reasonable. She unrolled the rendering on the hood of her car. It showed the entrance monument, fresh sod, low ornamental grasses, lighting, and a long sweep of simple landscaping that continued through the first corner lot. "We are improving the entrance before the regional showcase," she said. "Your frontage is part of the community presentation zone." I looked at the paper, then back at my yard. My frontage is my property. "It is community-facing," Dana said. "The board approved a unified design. Show me the recorded right to enter it, or show me where I gave you permission." Dana did not have either document with her. She pointed to the board approval line on the rendering and said the association had broad authority over presentation standards near the entrance. I told her a board vote might approve spending, but it could not turn a private yard into common property. She smiled in that careful way people do when they believe they are speaking to someone who does not understand the bigger picture. "Evan," she said, "we can finish this cleanly. The crew is here. It would be unfortunate to leave a partial site." "Then secure it," I said. "Shut off the irrigation, keep the soil from washing into the sidewalk, and preserve anything still alive. But nobody touches another plant until you show me authority." That was the first decision that mattered. I did not know then how far Dana had gone to make the project happen. I only knew that a half-finished construction site in my yard could become a very convenient piece of visual evidence for the HOA if I let them define it first. The garden had never been a fancy magazine garden. My father and I built it because the corner of the lot had always washed out after hard rain. We set the low stone terrace one weekend at a time, planted native shrubs where the soil held moisture, and ran simple irrigation zones so I did not have to drag hoses across the driveway every summer. The Japanese maple near the corner was small when we planted it. My father called it the only tree we had bought without arguing about the price. After he died, I kept working on the yard because it gave me something physical to do. Every spring I took pictures, partly because I liked seeing what survived the winter, and partly because I used to work in facilities maintenance. In that job, you learn quickly that memory is not a condition report. A condition report has dates, measurements, invoices, and photographs taken before someone starts telling you the damage was already there. By noon, Claire had pulled the old files from the hall cabinet. We found the original landscape sketch, irrigation invoices, photos from every year, and, more important, the architectural approval letter from the HOA. 8 years earlier, the same association had approved the terrace, the planting plan, and the small low-voltage path lights Dana was now calling inconsistent with the entrance design. We also found my closing survey. The common monument parcel ended several feet before our property line. There was no landscaping easement across the yard. There was no maintenance strip. There was no mysterious shared corner zone. The words Dana used sounded official because they were designed to sound official. They were not a property right. I sent Dana and the management company a short email that afternoon. I attached 2 survey pages, the old approval letter, and photographs from the morning. I asked them to preserve all project records, stop further work, retract any instruction to the contractor to enter my parcel, and explain what authority they believed they had. The reply came the next day. It did not answer my questions. The management company offered 2 pallets of sod and a basic irrigation repair if I signed a release. They described the work as a good-faith beautification effort and said the offer was intended to avoid a prolonged disagreement. Claire read it twice and set her phone down. They pulled up your yard and want to replace it with grass? That was exactly what they wanted. Sod was cheap, quick, and photogenic. It would cover the torn soil for the showcase. It would also erase the terrace, the planting plan, and the fact that the crew had damaged something the HOA did not own. I replied that I would not sign a release until the full condition of the yard had been assessed. I asked them again for the right of entry and owner authorization. 2 days later, the HOA sent me a violation notice. It said my front yard was unfinished, hazardous, and non-uniform. I had 10 days to cure the condition or face a fine. I read it 3 times because I thought I had missed something. The association had ordered the work, stopped only after I confronted the crew, then cited me for the condition the stopped work created. The notice also said the entrance project had been delayed by one homeowner's refusal to cooperate. That part made its way into a neighborhood email before I had even finished my coffee. At first, I was angry enough to want to reply to everyone. Claire talked me out of it. She said the people reading the email had not seen what we saw. They had not watched a bucket lift stone and roots out of our yard. They had only heard that someone was holding up a project. So I did not write a speech. I started a file. The job number from my video led me back to Lena at Greenline. I called her office, explained that I owned the parcel, and asked for the public-facing project documents related to work performed on it. I did not accuse her of trespass. I did not threaten her. I told her I was trying to understand who had authorized a crew to enter my yard. Lena called me back that afternoon. She said she had reviewed the address and had spoken to her supervisor. Greenline had a signed HOA work order. Because I had shown proof of ownership, she could provide the pages identifying my parcel and the photographs her crew took before work began. The work order had one line that changed the whole story. Owner authorization confirmed by association. Below that was a site note. The crew had asked whether the landscape scope crossed the common monument parcel because the rendering was not clear at the corner. The response, entered by a coordinator, said the association had confirmed the frontage as included and instructed the crew to proceed. Lena's before-work photographs were even more useful. They showed the terrace intact, the irrigation heads in place, the shrubs healthy, and the maple standing upright with its root zone undisturbed. Dana could say the garden looked untidy. She could not say it had been ruined before Greenline arrived. I asked Lena how Greenline normally handled private property work. She explained that the company did not research ownership for every HOA project. It relied on the customer to identify the work area and obtain access. That was why the authorization line existed. It was not decorative language added after the fact. Someone at Greenline had asked the HOA to confirm permission before the crew mobilized, and someone acting for the HOA had confirmed it. Lena also sent a copy of the daily field report. It showed when the crew arrived, who checked the site, and when I stopped the work. There was a short notation beside the address, frontage continuation per association direction. The phrase connected the private section to the entrance rendering, without pretending the contractor had made an independent property decision. I added the report to the file and did not ask Lena for anything outside the work performed on my parcel. The management company was slower to respond. Cedar Ridge's document policy allowed owners to inspect non-privileged association records with reasonable notice, so I requested the board resolution, approved project scope, vendor proposal, change orders, and minutes, referring to the entrance work. Elaine acknowledged the request and said some material would require review. I expected delay. Collecting records is rarely a scene where someone opens one perfect folder. It is usually a series of ordinary emails, missing attachments, and follow-up questions. The first packet contained the budget resolution and a general vendor proposal. The resolution approved money for entrance landscaping but did not list my address. The proposal described work at the monument parcel and adjacent visual frontage, a phrase broad enough to look useful until you compared it with the plat. There was no signed consent, no parcel exhibit showing authority, and no change order approved by the owner. The meeting minutes were more revealing because of what they did not say. Dana had presented the showcase deadline and the need for a unified entrance. Two board members asked whether the design could be completed within the approved amount. Nobody recorded a discussion about entering a private lot. That meant the vote Dana relied on had never tested the question she claimed it resolved. I sent Elaine one follow-up question. Which document had been provided to Greenline as proof of owner authorization? Her answer was careful. Management had transmitted the board-approved scope, but the authorization confirmation had come from the association's project contact. Was the project contact? That did not prove every part of the claim by itself. It did keep the causal chain simple. The board approved a budget. Dana served as project contact. Greenline asked about access. The association confirmed owner authorization. The crew entered. The yard was damaged. Each link existed before I ever calculated $1. That was when I stopped treating the situation as a fight over landscaping taste. Because the HOA had issued a violation, offered a release, and certified my consent to a contractor, I disputed the violation in writing, requested preservation of board records and project emails, and told both the HOA and Greenline that I was arranging independent assessments. I was preparing a property loss claim, but I was not ready to submit one until the condition, cause, and restoration scope could each be supported. I was careful about the scope. I was not going to claim that my father's weekends had a market price. I was not going to put a number on every memory in the yard. What I could do was document what it would cost to put the property back into a sound, functional condition and to monitor the maple the crew had exposed. Priya Shah, an arborist recommended by a nursery we had used for years, was the first person I called. She warned me not to let anyone grade, sod, or repeatedly walk over the exposed root zone before she inspected it. Tree damage could declare itself months later, which meant a quick cosmetic repair might destroy the very evidence needed to choose the right treatment. I also booked a restoration contractor, but his first available site visit was the following week. Until both professionals had inspected the yard, I had photographs and invoices, but no honest total. That delay was inconvenient. It also kept me from throwing out a dramatic number that the records could not support. For about 3 weeks, the situation was less dramatic than people imagine and more stressful than I expected. The work had stopped, but a stopped project does not disappear. The torn portion of the yard was covered with temporary fabric and stakes. The irrigation system was shut off in the affected zone. A hard rain pushed muddy water toward the sidewalk, and Green Line came back to put in temporary erosion control without touching anything else. Every time I came home, I saw the gap where the terrace had been. The HOA's 10-day violation clock kept running while all of this happened. I appealed it through the management portal and attached the same photographs I had already sent. The appeal was not a complicated legal document. It said the condition was caused by an HOA-directed contractor, that the association had been notified, and that I disputed any demand that I correct damage before the responsible parties established a restoration plan. The appeal created a second process running beside the loss claim. Cedar Ridge's rules required a hearing before the fine became final, so I requested one. Dana initially suggested postponing it until the landscaping dispute was resolved. I declined because the 10-day cure language was already in the record. If the HOA wanted the notice open, I wanted my objection attached to it on time. At the hearing, I did not present the entire future claim. I showed the morning photographs, the stop work confirmation, and the old ARC approval. I asked 3 practical questions. What exact condition had I created? What corrective action could I perform without disturbing evidence or violating PREA's root zone instructions? And why was the party that ordered the work treating the resulting condition as an owner violation? The committee members were visibly uncomfortable, though none of them made a dramatic statement. One asked whether I would accept temporary sod. I explained that sod would require grading and irrigation work inside the damaged area, potentially changing the evidence and harming the maple roots. Another asked whether temporary screening could address the appearance. I said I had already installed the safety rope and erosion controls recommended by professionals. I was willing to maintain those while the responsible parties reviewed restoration. The committee did not dismiss the notice that evening. It held the fine in abeyance. That was not a victory, but it removed the immediate monetary pressure and created a record that the condition was under professional review. It also prevented Dana from telling residents that I had ignored a cure deadline. I had answered it through the association's own procedure. Claire noticed the change before I did. The neighborhood email thread became quieter. A few residents who had assumed I was refusing free landscaping began asking what the crew had actually damaged. I answered privately and briefly. I sent no photographs unless someone asked, and I never sent Dana's internal correspondence. The point was not to recruit a side. It was to stop the HOA's description from becoming the only description. Tom's photographs helped with that. One showed Dana beside the rendering before the excavator crossed fully into the garden. The other showed the machine positioned over the broken terrace. Tom signed a short statement identifying the date and explaining why he had taken the pictures. He was nervous about it. I told him he was not accusing anyone of intent. He was simply confirming what he observed. There was a temptation to collect every opinion in the neighborhood. I resisted it. 10 vague statements would not improve one time-stamped photograph. My facility's background had taught me that a file gets weaker when important facts are buried under material that does not change the decision. So the package stayed lean: ownership, authority, condition, damage, and cost. The violation hearing also revealed something about Dana's strategy. She kept returning to visual standards because visual standards were within the HOA's normal authority. She avoided the entry question because it was not. That distinction helped me keep the narration in my own head clear. This was not a fight over whether an HOA could regulate appearance. It was a fight over whether appearance rules allowed the HOA to hire machinery to reconstruct private property without consent. Elaine Foster from management replied that the violation would remain open pending board review. Her message had the tone of someone trying not to take sides. I understood that. Management companies do not want to be in the middle of a board mistake. But the effect was still useful to Dana. The open violation meant she could tell people the yard was non-compliant, while the people who made it non-compliant decided what to do. Claire wanted to put a sign in the yard explaining everything. I said no, not because I was above it, but because a sign would have turned the story into two neighbors shouting through competing pieces of cardboard. I wanted the records to do the talking. The one exception was a simple temporary rope line around the damaged area. Priya had asked for it because people stepping on the exposed root zone would make the maple's chances worse. That was not a political statement. It was basic plant care. Our next-door neighbor, Tom Alvarez, came over one evening while I was checking the rope line. He had seen the crew arrive that morning. He said he assumed I had hired them because the entrance project had been going on across the corner for several days. Then he noticed the excavator had crossed the property marker near our sidewalk. I thought it looked strange, he told me. But Dana was there for a while, so I figured you knew. That was an uncomfortable detail, but it mattered. Dana had not merely approved a rendering from an email chain. She had been on site long enough for a neighbor to see her while the crew crossed onto the lot. Tom did not want to get involved in a fight. I told him he did not need to. I asked only whether he would send me the 2 photos he had taken because he thought the new entrance landscaping looked nice. In both photos, the excavator was inside my yard and Dana's SUV was parked at the curb. That was another lesson from maintenance work. People rarely take a picture because they expect it to become evidence. They take it because something looks unusual, attractive, annoying, or worth sending to a family member. The context comes later. Tom's photos did not prove intent by themselves. They simply narrowed the timeline and kept Dana from claiming she learned about the private parcel after the crew had started. When I sent the formal loss package, I organized it by category rather than emotion. First came ownership and authorization, the deed, survey, plat, ARC approval, work order, and field note. Next came pre-loss condition, annual photos, green lines before work images, the terrace invoice, and irrigation records. Then came current condition, my video, stop work photographs, the exposed irrigation, and Priya's report. Last came the cost scope. I used a cover page that said something plain. This is a restoration request, not a demand for an upgraded yard. That distinction mattered. The HOA's first offer had tried to redefine the loss as an opportunity for a cheaper new look. Our package asked them to restore the function and character of what had been damaged, using reasonable available materials and allowing for the fact that some mature plants could only be approximated. Priya spent almost an hour with the maple. She scraped a little soil from the root flare, checked the compacted area, and looked at the wounds on 2 exposed roots. She said the tree had a chance because the excavation had stopped when it did. That was not comforting exactly, but it gave me something real to work with. Her plan involved air spading compacted soil, mulching correctly, limiting foot traffic, and monitoring the canopy through 2 growing seasons. The restoration contractor, a man named Colin Webb, was equally careful in a different way. He did not walk around saying every plant was irreplaceable. He counted stone. He measured the terrace footprint. He mapped each broken irrigation zone. He called suppliers about available sizes for the shrubs and maple alternatives. He separated immediate repair from follow-up care. When he sent the estimate, I checked it against the site notes with the same habit I used for library contracts. Every number needed a physical reason. The $68,400 total became less abstract once the line items were visible. Soil remediation, grading, and erosion control were $9,600 because the excavator had compacted and displaced material that had to support the rebuilt planting. Irrigation reconstruction was $7,800 because the crew had cut multiple zones, not one pipe. The stone terrace was $15,400 because it had to be dismantled safely, rebuilt on a stable base, and tied back into the grade. Replacement planting and installation were $20,800. PREA's stabilization and monitoring were $5,900. Independent assessment and restoration design came to $4,100. Temporary safety and documented incidental costs were $4,800. No one number was outrageous on its own. The total was what happened when an unauthorized project damaged several systems at once. Submitting the package produced a questionnaire, not an answer. The carrier wanted every scope, every person who could approve field changes, and Greenline's normal owner access form. Elaine sent the questions to the board with a 5-business-day deadline. The HOA had to describe its process in boxes instead of speeches. One box asked for the name of the property owner who had granted access. Dana entered my name. The next box asked for the date and method of consent. She wrote, "Confirmed through project coordination," without a date. Marcus returned the form and asked for the email, signature, recording, or portal entry behind that phrase. There was none. Dana had turned the work order assumption into a second written statement, and the second statement still could not identify an act of consent. Elaine's answer about field changes was more useful. Greenline could adjust plant placement within an approved work area, but expansion beyond that area required a revised scope. The common parcel was the approved work area in the management file. No revised parcel exhibit had been attached before the crew entered my yard. The failure was no longer one blurry rendering. The designer had flagged the boundary, management had a common parcel scope, and Dana had supplied the assurance that carried the crew across both. The HOA forwarded the package to its liability carrier. A week later, Marcus Bell, the field adjuster, came to the house with Lena from Greenline and a management representative. Dana arrived carrying the board binder. Marcus did not ask whether the finished rendering was attractive. He began with 3 narrower questions: who owned the parcel, who authorized entry, and what condition had the crew documented before work began. I gave him the recorded survey, the old ARC approval, and Greenline's own pre-work photographs. Dana gave him the resolution approving the entrance budget. Marcus read it, then asked where it identified my parcel or authorized anyone to enter it. Dana said the board could manage community presentation standards. Marcus acknowledged that answer and repeated the question about written owner consent. The binder did not contain any. During that visit, Elaine also produced the designer's earlier email. The designer had noticed that the concept crossed beyond the monument parcel and told the board to verify ownership before extending the plan. Her note said written owner consent would be needed for private frontage. Dana's reply consisted of 4 words: "I'll handle the frontage." It was not a confession. It was evidence that the boundary question had reached the person directing the project before the machine entered my yard. Marcus, the adjuster, asked Colin a question I appreciated. If the association had stopped after the first pass, would this entire scope be necessary? Colin said no. Some costs would be lower. But the work had already broken the terrace, cut irrigation, compacted soil, and removed established plants. The scope was not based on the worst imaginable outcome. It was based on the condition they found. Dana tried a different explanation during the site walk. She said the HOA had assumed the frontage was part of an informal maintenance area because the original developer had always landscaped around the monument. Marcus asked whether anyone had a recorded document supporting that assumption. Dana pointed to the continuity of the grass and the entrance lights. Marcus did not argue with her about the appearance. He only noted that appearance was not a right of entry. That was the point where I stopped feeling like I had to persuade every person in the room. The claim process was not asking whether Dana's project would have looked better. It was asking whether the association had the authority to order work on the parcel and whether the resulting loss was documented. Those were smaller questions than the HOA had tried to make the dispute, and they were much harder for Dana to answer. The designer email made the answers worse. The landscape designer had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. She had done what a competent designer should do. She saw that the visual concept crossed a parcel boundary and flagged the need for consent. Dana's reply was casual, which is why it mattered. She did not say she would obtain consent. She said she would handle the frontage, then sent the work forward. Marcus asked for the designer's original attachment and the transmission history. The attachment had 2 layers, the common monument area and a conceptual continuation across my frontage. A small note near the property edge read, "Ownership, permission to be verified." On a presentation print, the note was easy to miss. In the working file, it was unmistakable. Dana said she believed the note referred to design approval, not physical access. The designer responded in writing that she had specifically meant ownership permission because the concept crossed the parcel line supplied by management. That exchange closed off another possible misunderstanding without requiring anyone to exaggerate. The warning was clear enough for a professional to stop. Dana had treated it as a task she could resolve informally. The carrier then separated the damage review from the coverage review. Marcus continued evaluating the physical loss, while another representative considered which parts of the association's conduct fell within the policy. That distinction was frustrating at first. I wanted one person to say who would pay, but it ultimately kept the project moving. The restoration scope could be tested even while the HOA and carrier argued about allocation. Greenline challenged 2 parts of Colin's estimate. It thought some replacement plants could be smaller, and that parts of the terrace stone could be reused. Colin revisited the site with Lena. They marked reusable stone, checked nursery availability, and revised quantities without changing the total restoration objective. Some savings in stone handling were offset by higher delivery costs for available plants. The final number remained $68,400, but now both sides understood why. Priya refused to guarantee the maple. Her report said stabilization was reasonable and monitoring necessary, not that money could erase root damage. The proposed settlement, therefore, funded care rather than inventing a value for a tree that was still alive. If the maple declined during the monitoring period because of the documented damage, the restoration plan included a defined replacement process. That clause kept the story grounded in what could actually happen over time. Meanwhile, Elaine placed the entrance project's remaining work on hold. The common parcel was safe, but unfinished. Residents drove past pallets of material and a blank patch beside the monument. Dana blamed the delay on the claim. The vendor records showed the wider truth. The project could have continued on common property at any time if the HOA had issued a corrected scope. The board chose not to do that because it wanted the original unified rendering. That detail mattered at the special meeting. It showed that the neighborhood had not been forced to choose between my property rights and a maintained entrance. The board had created that choice by refusing to separate authorized work from unauthorized work. Once residents saw the 2 parcels on the plat, the supposed conflict became much smaller. After the reservation of rights letter arrived, I called a friend who works in commercial insurance. I asked him what it meant without asking him to tell me how to run the claim. He said the carrier was protecting its ability to decide what was covered, but that did not erase the board's responsibility. If anything, he said, it put pressure on the HOA to evaluate its own exposure carefully instead of assuming an insurer would make the problem disappear. Dana's assessment message went out 2 days later. It did not call me by name, but everyone knew who it was about. It said a homeowner had made an excessive demand over an entrance project intended to benefit the community. It warned that board funds might be affected if the matter could not be resolved. The word assessment changed the temperature of the neighborhood immediately. 2 residents called Claire before dinner. One had recently replaced an air conditioning system and wanted to know whether a surprise HOA bill was coming. The other asked why one front yard could cost almost $70,000. Claire did not debate either of them. She said the same thing I had been saying. The number was an itemized restoration scope, and the board had not yet explained why its contractor had entered private property. I emailed the treasurer, Martin Cho, with a narrow question. Had the board calculated an assessment, or was Dana describing a possibility? Martin replied that none had been proposed, noticed, or voted on. The association had reserves, a pending insurance review, and possible vendor participation. He confirmed that residents had not received a calculation supporting Dana's warning. By the weekend, the useful question had shifted from what I might cost them to why the president had raised an assessment before the treasurer calculated one. I read it at the kitchen table with Claire. She asked whether we should finally show everyone Dana's email. I said not yet. The email had been produced for the claim review. I did not want to turn it into neighborhood gossip before the board had a chance to address it in the proper setting. I also did not want the story to become about humiliating Dana. I wanted the board to correct the damage and stop treating a property line like a design suggestion. So I made the chronology. 1 page. 7 dated entries. I kept the language dull on purpose. Dull records are difficult to twist. The garden was approved. The parcel line was recorded. The designer raised a consent issue. The HOA certified consent. The contractor documented a healthy yard. The work caused specific damage. Independent professionals priced the restoration. I attached the estimate and asked that the special meeting include the ownership and authorization issue, not just the total. The meeting notice brought more people than usual. Some came because of the assessment rumor. Some came because the entrance project was visible every time they drove home. A few came because they had received HOA violations themselves and knew how strange it felt to be called non-compliant by people who had not looked closely at the facts. I sat in the second row with Claire, the survey folder on my lap. Dana started with the project timeline. She talked about improving curb appeal and using reserve funds efficiently. She said the board had acted with the community's best interests in mind. I believed that she believed it. That did not make the entry lawful or the damage less real. When public comment opened, I put the chronology on the screen. I did not read every email. I did not show pictures of my father or talk about grief. I showed the old ARC approval because it was the HOA's own document. I showed the survey line because it was the cleanest answer to Dana's presentation zone theory. I showed the work order sentence because it explained why Green Line had entered. Then I showed the 7-item scope. One resident asked why the board had offered sod if it believed the garden had been unauthorized. No one answered for several seconds. Elaine finally said the offer had been intended as a practical compromise. The resident said, practical for whom? It was not a hostile question. It was worse than hostile. It was ordinary. Another resident asked whether the board had a policy for confirming a parcel before authorizing vendor work. Dana said the board generally relied on management and project maps. The resident asked whether that meant no one had to get owner consent. Dana said that was not what she meant, but the room had already understood the gap. Martin then addressed the assessment message without mentioning the claim strategy. He put 3 numbers on the screen: the entrance project balance, the insurance deductible, and the portion of reserves available for property losses. He explained that the board did not yet know its final share because Green Line and the carrier were still reviewing responsibility. He also said no special assessment could appear through an email warning. The governing documents required notice, a defined amount, and a board vote. That did not promise residents a $0 impact. It did something more honest. It replaced a threat with a process. A woman in the back asked whether reserve money belonged to the neighborhood. Martin said yes. She asked whether that meant the board should be careful before directing work beyond the parcel it owned. He said yes again. Dana looked down at her agenda, and the room moved on without applause. The board went into closed session for less than half an hour. When it returned, another director, not Dana, made 3 motions. The violation would remain suspended while council finalized its withdrawal. Management would prepare a parcel verification rule before any entrance work resumed. And council had authority to mediate the documented restoration claim within available insurance and reserve limits. None of those motions admitted intent. Together, they ended the fiction that the only problem was my refusal to accept sod. Before mediation, I asked Colin to review the estimate one last time for duplication. We removed a temporary watering allowance already included in the plant installation price. We added no emotional damages and no punitive multiplier. Later confirmed delivery and safety costs absorbed the small adjustment, so the supported total remained $68,400. I wanted to enter the room able to say we had searched for reasons to reduce the demand as carefully as we had searched for reasons to support it. My lawyer's role was narrow. She reviewed restoration milestones, payment timing, the release, and responsibility if a contractor uncovered hidden damage during repair. She warned me against accepting a lump sum paired with a vague promise that the HOA would choose every vendor. The remedy needed to follow the independent scope, or the association could turn compensation into a second attempt to redesign the yard. The mediation was scheduled after that meeting. Greenline attended with its representative. The HOA attended with Dana, Elaine, and council. The carrier had people in the process, though not everyone was in the same room at the same time. I went with Claire and a lawyer I hired only to review the settlement language. I did not need someone to create a dramatic case. I needed someone to make sure the release matched the work that would actually be done. There were moments when the discussion stalled over amounts. The contractor argued that some landscape replacement values were high. The HOA argued that the association did not intend to damage the yard. Both things could be true and still not change the central fact. The yard was damaged because the HOA directed work there under a false certification of consent. The harder argument was not the total but control of the money. The HOA proposed paying Greenline to manage the full restoration under a revised board scope. I understood why that looked efficient on paper. Greenline already knew the site, and its insurer wanted invoices tied to completed work, but it would have returned authority over my yard to the same chain that had crossed the boundary in the first place. I offered a narrower alternative. Greenline could bid on portions Colin considered appropriate, but Colin's plan would govern, and I would approve access dates. The HOA could receive photographs and invoices at milestones. Unused allowances would stay within approved restoration categories, and hidden damage would be documented before any scope change. Lena accepted those conditions. Council added that HOA inspection did not equal design control. Once authority was defined, the settlement became possible. Eventually, the numbers stopped being hypothetical. Greenline agreed to contribute because its crew entered the private parcel, even though it had relied on HOA authorization. The carrier agreed to participate while reserving its coverage position. The HOA agreed that any uncovered amount would come from its own reserve funds. The final written settlement was $68,400, exactly matching the documented restoration scope. The payment structure used 2 tracks. Certain immediate work would be paid after invoices, and the remaining funds would be released on a schedule so we could hire qualified restoration professionals ourselves. The HOA could inspect completed work, but it could not substitute Dana's rendering for Colin's plan. Green Line's contribution resolved its entry role. How the carrier and HOA allocated the balance was theirs to settle, not mine. The agreement also required the violation to be withdrawn in writing. That mattered to me more than I expected. I did not want a future buyer, a management company, or some later board member finding a record that suggested I had left my yard hazardous. Dana wanted a general note, saying the parties had resolved a landscaping disagreement. I objected, because the HOA's earlier message had called an owner obstructive. The final correction said work had extended onto a private parcel without documented consent. The resulting condition was not an owner violation, and restoration would proceed under the settlement. The policy change was straightforward. Before a vendor could enter a private lot, management had to verify the parcel using recorded information, document the scope, and obtain signed owner consent. If a vendor encountered a boundary question on site, the vendor had to stop until the association produced that documentation. It was the kind of rule most people assume already exists until they discover why it needs to be written down. The first payment did not arrive the next morning. It took 11 business days after signatures and tax forms. During that gap, the temporary controls stayed in place. Claire worried that the agreement was already failing. My lawyer pointed to the payment schedule and cure provision, which were different from Dana's early promises. We waited, and the funds arrived before the contractual deadline. Colin scheduled restoration in phases because repairing everything at once would have put heavy equipment back over the maple roots. Soil work approached from the driveway, with smaller machines. Irrigation trenches near the tree were reopened by hand. Reusable terrace stones were cleaned and stacked by size. It took longer, but every extra day had a physical reason tied to Priya's protection plan. The first heavy rain tested that plan before the terrace was rebuilt. Water collected along the temporary grade and moved toward the sidewalk. Colin compared the flow to his site photographs and added a shallow diversion within the erosion control allowance. No one called it new damage or reopened the settlement. The milestone process worked. Condition observed, cause checked, response documented. I did not stand over every worker. I reviewed the scope, photographed milestones, and asked questions when something did not match the plan. Green Line sent Lena back for part of the work. She apologized again without trying to defend the HOA's decision. I told her I appreciated that she had stopped the machine when she did. If she had insisted on continuing, the damage would have been worse for everyone. The entrance showcase happened before our final planting was complete. Cedar Ridge placed temporary planters on the common parcel and finished the monument lighting without touching my lot. Visitors still found the entrance. Property values did not collapse. That small fact quietly disproved the urgency Dana had used to push the original scope. A private garden had never been necessary to make the common entrance presentable. By late fall, the terrace looked like a terrace again. The irrigation controller worked. The new plants were smaller than the ones we lost, but they were healthy. In early spring, Priya returned for the maple's first full assessment. A few upper branches had sparse buds, but the trunk and most of the canopy were stable. She adjusted the watering plan and recommended waiting before pruning. Recovery was still a process, not a verdict. The new policy was tested sooner than anyone expected. A vendor planning fence repairs along another side lot found that the HOA map did not match the recorded parcel exhibit. Management stopped the job, contacted the owner, and corrected the scope. Nothing happened, which was exactly the point. Good controls make the next story too boring to tell. At the next regular meeting, the board removed Dana as project contact and assigned vendor coordination to management under the verification policy. No one had demanded her resignation as part of our settlement. Board politics were separate from compensation for my yard. Procedures changed first, at the speed they could actually change. At the annual meeting, Elaine included a one-page project control report in the packet. It listed whether every vendor job since the change touched common property, private property, or a recorded easement. Most needed only a parcel check. 2 required owner signatures. 1 was redesigned to remain on common land. The report was dull, but it proved the policy was being used. Dana said the entrance project had exposed weaknesses in how the association translated design concepts into field instructions. She did not apologize to me by name, and I did not ask her to perform one for the room. The corrected record, funded restoration, and working controls mattered more than a polished sentence. Dana lost her officer position in the election, though she remained a resident like everyone else. Claire and I walked home before the budget discussion ended. We passed the monument and the edge where the rendering had blurred common space into our lot. New brass markers sat near the planting bed after management's parcel review. They were small, almost easy to miss. That suited me. A boundary does not need to be theatrical. It only needs to be known before the machinery starts. What changed most was the way people described the property afterward. No one called it a community presentation zone. They called it Evans' Yard. The money rebuilt what could be rebuilt, but the stop work rule carried the more durable lesson. Uncertainty at a boundary was a reason to pause, not permission to push through and explain later. Months later, I set 1 recovered terrace stone at the edge of the rebuilt wall. I had a small date carved into it, the year my father and I started the garden. It was not a monument to the dispute. It was just a way of keeping the beginning visible after so much of the middle had been torn apart. The entrance monument at Cedar Ridge still looks nicer than it did before. The HOA got its landscaping. My yard got rebuilt. But the new policy is clear, and the board knows why it exists. The phrase Dana used that morning still comes back to me sometimes. Community facing. She was right about one thing. Our front yards are where people see us. They are not where other people get to decide they own us.